their faces lay nothing of the usual mobility, liveliness, and cheeriness of youth. Many of them told me that they felt not the slightest inclination to play out of doors on Saturday and Sunday, but preferred to be quiet at home. I add, at once, another passage of Hawkins' report, which only half belongs here, but may be quoted here as well as anywhere else. Intemperance, excess, and want of providence are the chief faults of the factory population, and these evils may be readily traced to the habits which are formed under the present system, and almost inevitably arise from it. It is universally admitted that indigestion, hypochondria, and general debility affect this class to a very great extent. After 12 hours of monotonous toil, it is but natural to look about for a stimulant of one sort or another, but when the above-mentioned diseased conditions are added to the customary weariness, people will quickly and repeatedly take refuge in spirituous liquors. For all this testimony of the physicians and commissioners, the report itself offers hundreds of cases of proof that the growth of young operatives is stunted by their work. Hundreds of statements testify. Among others, Cowell gives the weight of 46 youths of 17 years of age, from one Sunday school, of whom 26 employed in mills, averaged £104 and 50 pence, and 20 not employed in mills, £117 and 70 pence. One of the largest manufacturers of Manchester, leader of the opposition against the workingmen, I think Robert Hyde Gregg himself, said, on one occasion, that if things went on as at present, the operatives of Lancashire would soon be a race of pygmies. 159A A recruiting officer 159B testified that operatives are little adapted for military service, looked thin and nervous, and were frequently rejected by the surgeons as unfit. In Manchester he could hardly get men of 5 feet 8 inches, they were usually only 5 feet 6 to 7, whereas in the agricultural districts, most of the recruits were 5 feet 8. The men wear out very early in consequence of the conditions under which they live and work. Most of them are unfit for work at 40 years, a few hold out to 45, almost none to 50 years of age. This is caused not only by the general enfeeblement of the frame, but also very often by a failure of the sight, which is a result of mule spinning, in which the operative is obliged to fix his gaze upon a long row of fine parallel threads, and so greatly to strain the sight. Of 1,600 operatives employed in several factories in Harper and Lanark, but 10 were over 45 years of age. Of 22,094 operatives in diverse factories in Stockport and Manchester, but 143 were over 45 years old. Of these 143, 16 were retained as a special favour, and one was doing the work of a child. A list of 131 spinners contained, but 7 over 45 years, and yet the whole 131 were rejected by the manufacturers, to whom they applied for work, as too old, and were without means of support by reason of old age. Mr. Ashworth, a large manufacturer, admits in a letter to Lord Ashley, that, towards the 40th year, the spinners can no longer prepare the required quantity of yarn, and are therefore sometimes discharged. He calls operatives 40 years of age old people. Commissioner Mackintosh expresses himself in the same way in the report of 1833. Although I was prepared for it from the way the children are employed, I still found it difficult to believe the statements of the older hands as to their ages. They age so very early. Surgeon Smellie, of Glasgow, who treated operatives chiefly, says that 40 years is old age for them. 160A and similar evidence may be found elsewhere. 160B in Manchester. This premature old age among the operatives is so universal that almost every man of 40 would be taken for 10 to 15 years older, while the prosperous classes, men as well as women, preserve their appearance exceedingly well, if they do not drink too heavily. The influence of factory work upon a female physique also is marked and peculiar. The deformities entailed by long hours of work are much more serious among women. Protracted work frequently causes deformities of the pelvis, partly in the shape of abnormal position and development of the hip bones, partly of malformation of the lower portion of the spinal column. Although, says Dr. Loudon, in his report, no example of malformation of the pelvis, and of some other affections came under my notice, these things are nevertheless so common, that every physician must regard them as probable consequences of such working hours, and as vouched for besides by men of the highest medical credibility. that factory operatives undergo more difficult confinement than other women as testified to by several midwives and accoucheurs, and also that they are more liable to miscarriage. 161 Moreover, they suffer from the general enfeeblement common to all operatives, and, when pregnant, continue to work in the factory up to the hour of delivery, because otherwise they lose their wages, and are made to fear that they may be replaced if they stop away too soon. It frequently happens that women are at work one evening and deliver the next morning, and the case is none too rare of their being delivered in the factory among the machinery. And if the gentlemen of the bourgeoisie find nothing particularly shocking in this, their wives will perhaps admit that it is a piece of cruelty, an infamous act of barbarism, indirectly to force a pregnant woman to work 12 or 13 hours daily, formerly still longer, up to the day of her delivery, in a standing position, with frequent stoopings. But this is not all. If these women are not obliged to resume work within 2 weeks, they are thankful, and count themselves fortunate. Many come back to the factory after 8, and even after 3 to 4 days, to resume full work. I once heard the manufacturer ask an overlooker, "Is so-and-so not back yet?" "No." "How long since she was confined?" "A week." "She might surely have been back long ago." That one over there only stays 3 days. Naturally, fear of being discharged, dread of starvation drives her to the factory in spite of her weakness, in defiance of her pain. The interest of the manufacturer will not brook that his employees stay at home by reason of illness. They must not be ill, they must not venture to lie still through a long confinement, or he must stop his machinery or trouble his supreme head with a temporary change of arrangements, and rather than do this, he discharges his people when they begin to be ill. Listen 162a. A girl feels very ill, can scarcely do her work. Why does she not ask permission to go home? The master is very particular, and if we are away half a day, we risk being sent away altogether. Or Sir Barry 162b. Thomas McDirt, workman, has slight fever. Cannot stay at home longer than 4 days, because he would fear of losing his place. And so it goes on in almost all the factories. The employment of young girls produces all sorts of irregularities during the period of development. In some, especially those who are better fed, the heat of the factories hastens this process, so that in single cases, girls of 13 and 14 are wholly mature. Robertson, whom I have already cited, mentioned in the Factories Inquiry Commission's report as the eminent gynecologist of Manchester, relates in the North of England Medical and Surgical Journal, that he had seen a girl of 11 years who was not only a wholly developed woman, but pregnant, and that it was by no means rare in Manchester for women to be confined at 15 years of age. In such cases, the influence of the warmth of the factories is the same as that of a tropical climate, and, as in such climates, the abnormally early development revenges itself by correspondingly premature age and ability. On the other hand, retarded development of the female constitution occurs. The breasts mature late or not at all. 162c. Menstruation first appears in the 17th or 18th, sometimes in the 20th year, and is often wholly wanting. 163a. Irregular menstruation, coupled with great pain and numerous affections, especially with anemia, is very frequent. As the medical reports unanimously state, children of such mothers, particularly of those who are obliged to work during pregnancy, cannot be vigorous. They are, on the contrary, described in the report, especially in Manchester, as very feeble, and Barry alone asserts that they are healthy, but says further, that in Scotland, where his inspection lay, almost no married women worked in factories. Moreover, most of the factories there are in the country with the exception of Glasgow, a circumstance which contributes greatly to the invigoration of the children. The operatives' children in the neighbourhood of Manchester are nearly all thriving and rosy, while those within the city look pale and scrofulous, but with the 9th year the colour vanishes suddenly, because all are then sent into the factories, when it soon becomes impossible to distinguish the country from the city children. But besides all this, there are some branches of factory work which have an especially injurious effect. In many rooms of the cotton and flax spinning mills, the air is filled with fibrous dust, which produces chest affections, especially among workers in the carding and combing rooms. Some constitutions can bear it, some cannot, but the operative has no choice. He must take the room in which he finds work, whether his chest is sound or not. The most common effects of this breathing of dust are blood spitting, hard noisy breathing, pains in the chest, coughs, sleeplessness, in short, all the symptoms of asthma, ending in the worst cases in consumption. 163b. Especially unwholesome is the wet spinning of linen yarn which is carried on by young girls and boys. The water spurts over them from